October 14th edition of the Global News Review. Thanks for joining Ambassador Dick Bowers and Dr. Breck Walker and I and our special guest today. We've got with us David-Plazas, the opinion engagement editor from the Tennessean and the USA Today network in Tennessee. David, thanks for joining us today.
Well, it's my pleasure, Pat. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, you bet.
How's it going?
And we appreciate you having been on our Global Nashville with Carl Dean program at the end of September. That was a terrific conversation about things going on in Nashville and what challenges the city faces. So I would recommend that our viewers visit our youtube.com/TNWAC video archive. All of the programs are there, and you can see David and former Mayor Carl Dean talking about those important issues. But today we're going to talk with David about journalism and reporters under attack around the world, and what's happening in the suppression of freedom of the press and problems stemming from the proliferation of people talking about fake news, undercutting the credibility of journalism. That is topic two. Dick, Breck, good to see you.
Good to see you, Patrick. Welcome, David. Nice to see you.
Yeah, great to be here. Nice to get to meet David as well.
Okay, Dick, why don't you take us into...
Well, we've got our usual kind of three topics today, Pat, but I think any one of them we could spend the whole hour on, but we'll try to cut them short. First, we're going to talk about the World Food Program and Alfred Nobel. So, as you know, the World Food Program just got the Nobel Peace Prize. Secondly, world press freedom under attack, and David's going to take the lead on that. And then we've got an incredibly fascinating topic, at least for me: nuclear weapons, Dexamethasone, and the 25th Amendment. And they all tie together very neatly, so as you will see. So those are our three topics, Pat.
Okay, and Breck, welcome back after your week sabbatical. It's good to have you back in the crew here. And why don't you start us off with the weekly quiz question?
Great, Pat. Thanks. And it's great to be back with you guys for sure. So this week we've added a question to the What in the World quiz from a United States Institute of Peace report. The Tennessee World Affairs Council, TNWAC, has enjoyed a close relationship with the U.S. Institute of Peace. And we're pleased to highlight the insightful reports they have on their website by adding a question from that report each week. So each week, question number 5 in our weekly quiz will be a U.S. Institute of Peace question of the week. So here's the question this week. As people in Belarus continue massive protest against an autocratic ruler and a rigged election, risks are rising that Russia's military could take a direct role, a less visible than an overt invasion, but a role projecting power westward toward NATO and threatening Ukraine from the north. So the question is, what is the one critical difference between the pro-democracy protests in Belarus from those in Ukraine? And the possibilities are: A, protesters in Minsk do not seek a sharp break with Russia. B, protesters in Kiev did not seek a sharp break with Russia. C, protesters in Minsk seek closer ties with NATO and the West. And D, protesters in Kiev did not seek closer ties with NATO and the West. And for those who are interested in foreign affairs, it's very worthwhile to take a look at the U.S. Institute of Peace website and see all the information that's there. And you can visit that at usip.org. So, Pat?
All right. Well, thanks for that, Breck. And I would also suggest taking a look at what's going on in Belarus. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago when the protests really turned ugly, and there was question about Russian involvement. But the protests have continued almost nonstop, and it remains to be seen whether the Russians will become more actively involved. What's going to happen there? Whether Lukashenko will step down or somehow yield to the protests, because there's no sign that the protests are going to continue. I'd also mention on the top of the show here, another item that we could have done a deep dive on is the continuing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh. We did talk about that 2 weeks ago when that started up. And again, that's another conflict that's continuing apace. So those are issues, conflicts, protests, really important issues in the day-to-day. So we hope that you'll keep up with those, and we'll undoubtedly talk about those again on future Global News Review programs. But for now, let's jump into topic number one: the World Food Program and the Nobel Peace Prize. Dick or Breck, I think you're going to lead us on that one.
I think Breck's doing it.
Yeah,
I'm just going to kibitz from time to time.
Thank you very much. Well, feel free to jump in absolutely anytime. But last week, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee awarded the Peace Prize to the United Nations World Food Program, which was in some sense a bit of an upset, or at least somewhat of an unexpected outcome, because many commentators thought that the award was going to go to either the World Health Organization or to the Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg. But it was awarded to the WFP, the United Nations World Food Program, and the Nobel Committee said why they were giving the award to the WFP, said it was being given, quote, for its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict, close quote. And the committee went on to say that in particular during this COVID pandemic, the WFP had acted heroically, and the committee closed with this comment, quote, the world is in danger of experiencing a hunger crisis of inconceivable proportions if the World Food Program and other food assistance organizations do not receive the financial support they have requested, close quote. And Pat, I thought I'd give just very briefly a little history about the World Food Program, which is the food assistance branch of the United Nations. And it came about back in 1961 in a call from President Dwight Eisenhower just before he left office. And President Eisenhower said that he thought it was worth experimenting to see if the UN could develop a food distribution program to deal with world hunger. And here we are 60 years later, and the WFP is the largest humanitarian organization focused on hunger and food security. It's headquartered in Rome. It has offices in 80 countries. It has a staff of more than 17,000. It has a litany of equipment, including 5,600 trucks, 30 ships, and almost 100 airplanes that are on the move every day, delivering food to people that are hungry and don't have access to the amount of food that they need. In 2019, the WFP gave food to over 100 million people in what they say were as many as 15 billion aggregate meals, or rations as they call it. And 2/3 of that activity was in combat zones. So the WFP is doing tremendous work under very difficult conditions. It is consistently thought to be one of the most well-respected UN agencies in terms of getting the job done, as I said, in very difficult environments and at reasonable cost. And the one other thing I'd add, just for interest's sake, is if you're wondering how big a problem world hunger is, well, the WFP estimates that perhaps as much as 10% of the world's population faces some serious degree of food insecurity. That's 800 million people who at one point or another during the year are going hungry. And every year these people are dependent on good weather, decent economies, peace in their area, if they are to have food on their table. And when those conditions don't prevail, the WFP gets involved in a massive way. And of course, the COVID pandemic has ramped up those numbers considerably because of not only the deep worldwide recession that's been caused, but as well the disruption to supply chains. So, Dick, let me stop for a minute and see if you have anything you want to add at this point.
I'll just throw in that they've got a hard-charging executive director. I guess there's a 36-member state board that controls the activities and actions of the food program, and all of their money comes from contributions, and mostly from nation states that are members of the UN and try to support this activity. But their executive director, David Beasley, is in the middle of a 5-year term, so he's somewhat responsible for the activities of the organization winning the Peace Prize. And he's a former governor of South Carolina. So he's an interesting guy. And while he was in South Carolina, he got the John F. Kennedy Medal for Courage by stepping out and saying the Confederate battle flag should no longer fly over the capital of South Carolina.
And Dick, let me add too, because that's really interesting. As you said, all contributions going to the WFP are voluntary. And in 2019 and 2020, these funds are down a little bit because of the pandemic. But in 2019, the World Food Program raised about $8 billion. And roughly $3.4 billion of that came from the US. And the rest comes from other governments, from corporations and private individuals. And just for interest's sake, the top 6 givers in the US is far and away more than 3 times as much as anybody else. But the top 6 givers to the WFP are the USA, Germany, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and then Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are number 5 and number 6. And just for interest's sake, toward the bottom of national givers to the WFP, France comes in at $70,000. Now that's versus $3.4 billion from the US. And the Principality of Monaco comes in at $11,000. So there's a wide spread. But one of the things about David Beasley, who you mentioned, who's the executive director and former Republican governor of South Carolina, he became the executive director in 2017, significantly supported by 2 South Carolinians that have come to play prominent roles in the Trump administration, Nikki Haley, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, and Senator Lindsey Graham, who sits on a subcommittee, an appropriations subcommittee that's responsible for how much the U.S. funds the UN. And as everybody's read about, President Trump has gone about throughout his administration cutting back funding of UN agencies. And of course, this summer announced withdrawal with the U.S. withdrawal from the World Health Organization. But the one agency, thanks to David Beasley, that the Trump administration has funded significantly more is the World Food Program. When former Governor Beasley came into office, the U.S. contribution at that point was $2.5 billion. And as I said, it's gone up to $3.4 billion. And so politics plays a significant role in these, as you'd expect, in the fortunes of these international aid agencies. So I just pass that along.
I think that's a great point, Breck, because in international diplomacy, international relationships are critical. And the fact that you've got Lindsey Graham and Nikki Haley supporting this organization goes a long way in helping to prime the pump to get the dollars flowing into it. So good for them.
Hey, and I have a question for you, Dick. After just a very brief introduction, the Nobel Peace Prize was set up by Alfred Nobel, who was a Swedish entrepreneur, scientist, chemical engineer, and whose most famous invention was dynamite. And he set up, when he accumulated a huge fortune, and when he died in 1896, he set up 5 different Nobel Prizes, of which the Peace Prize is probably the most prominent, and funded those prizes. So they have a monetary award every year, and he designated in his will that there would be a Norwegian committee that would decide the recipients of these prizes over time. Now here's my question. There are 21 Americans that have received the Nobel Peace Prize, and that includes people like Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, and most recently Barack Obama. But there are 2 Tennesseans that have received the Nobel Peace Prize. And would you happen to know who those are? I looked it up. So
I think I can get one. Cordell Hull.
Cordell Hull is one. That's exactly right. Former Secretary of State in the Roosevelt administration.
And the second one, I'm not sure.
Well, the second one invented the internet.
Oh, David knows.
Al Gore.
Al Gore.
Oh, I should know that. There you go. Good.
So, and the one other thing I'd mention just for interest's sake is most people would say the most notable omission for never having, for somebody that deserved but never did receive the Nobel Peace Prize, Mahatma Gandhi never received it. Interesting.
Well, that tells you something about politics and racism back in the day, huh?
It does.
Yeah,
I think it probably does.
politics plays a part. We're going to cut this segment short, but I'll just mention that the World Food Program is receiving money from nation states, but they also get contributions from individuals. And if you go to
Yeah.
Facebook, you can find the World Food Program page there. If you like it, you'll get some of their announcements and have a place to donate to the WFP, which obviously is an extremely worthwhile program. There's no more satisfying feeling than feeding a hungry person. And we do have famine and starvation across large swaths of the world, and COVID-19 has not made that situation any better. All right, we're going to move on. We're going to put David in the hot seat here. And again, David comes to us from the Tennessean and the USA Today network. And I'll mention that David is also playing a part in our debate party, debate night watch party on the 22nd of October. You can find that on the tnwac.org calendar. We're going to have a very interesting program before the debate. We will have the debate in our Zoom meeting, so you can watch it there, and we'll continue to chat during the debate. And then we're going to have a nice conversation about what we saw during debate following. And David is doing that in his role as the guru of Civility Tennessee. And David, before you start about journalists around the world, feel free to make a mention of Civility Tennessee and what that's about and where people can find it. I'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Pat. And Civility Tennessee is a campaign to promote, model, and encourage civil discourse and looking at the roots of citizens from the Latin roots, civitas, which is about the role of the citizen to be responsible, to challenge society, but also to uphold society. Polarization, which is not just an American crisis, is a worldwide crisis right now that we're seeing that has caused all sorts of strife, be it on issues such as climate change, trade policy, and right now, as we mentioned in the earlier segment, hunger. We're certainly seeing people as we look at an issue like coronavirus, for example, where we're having these discussions about who should get a vaccine. You know, is it just the richest countries, or does every country get access to it? And in terms of my international credentials, I worked an intern in Mexico City as a production assistant for foreigntv.com. It was a long ago defunct now .com in the late 90s that was headed by Peter Arnett, formerly of CNN, where we had a chance to talk about social and cultural news in Mexico. And I've always been interested in international affairs, and I'm thankful to Tennessee World Affairs Council for including me in programs. But this issue of journalism and journalists around the world, with growing autocracy, with growing authoritarianism and populism, we're seeing tremendous threats to freedoms, and not least of which is freedom of the press. Pat, you had mentioned Belarus, and according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, there have been 49 journalists who were detained in Belarus covering recent protests, and 8 are still being held. So it's perilous. Whether you're in a place like Minnesota or you're in Belarus, you are at tremendous risk just trying to do your job to cover these particular protests and events of the day. And it's particularly distressing when you have situations that of civil war or conflict, and this goes back to that whole conversation of how can we democratically, can we sit at the table and resolve our differences? In some cases, authoritarian powers simply do not want to do that. And journalists often are caught in the crosshairs of that. The Committee to Protect Journalists, according to their most recent data, there have been 19 journalists killed in 2020, 248 imprisoned in 2019, and 64 missing globally. A very prominent journalist, James Foley, who went to my alma mater, Northwestern, was beheaded by ISIS a few years ago. And there's a major award named after him by the Online News Association. It's become one of the most prominent global journalism organizations in the world, focusing on digital journalism. Because that's a big part of the way that we cover. It's not just the traditional print and television. Now we're doing journalism via WhatsApp and via social media sites. And those are getting censorship. You know, there's especially in these conversations about cryptocurrency. You know, what kind of information and data security issues? What can we report? What is being silenced? And this is really important to us. Part of the slides that you had shown was Maria Ressa. And this is one thing I want to talk about just for a little bit, which is Maria Ressa is a Filipina journalist who founded Rappler, which was an investigative journalism site online. And it has been very critical of President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines for his extrajudicial killings of people during this drug war that the Philippines is having. And she's been reporting on it and has been a target of Duterte and she actually was convicted of crimes against the government and is fighting it. She's appealing those crimes, but she's been arrested numerous times. And I had the privilege of watching her speak last year at the News Leaders Association in New Orleans, and also had a chance to meet her briefly to talk about these issues of press freedom. And she's diminutive in size, but so strong in heart and courage. And one thing that she told us was the Philippines is the canary in the coal mine for the United States. Where freedom of the press goes there, we are sure to see a threat here in the United States. We obviously have a long history from the Spanish-American War, or as when I studied abroad in Spain, they like to call the War of 1898 and other names. As a funny aside, I was asked by a Spanish student why the United States decided to be aggressive towards Spain. I said, I wasn't there at the time, but people have long memories about global issues. And when it comes to the Philippines and its role, it's been a long-standing democracy in Southeast Asia, and it's coming under attack. The press, the reason why it's important, not just speaking as a journalist, but as a citizen, we need to know what the government is doing. We need to know how the government is using our resources and how it's treating its citizens. And as we're seeing in the case of Belarus and other countries, they're being treated very badly. We're not seeing elections that are being conducted fairly. And sadly, I wish I would not have to say that. We're now, starting to look at, we don't know what kind of transition we're going to have here in the United States. There was even a op-ed in the New York Times recently that called for speaking to the international community if this election is not resolved in a peaceful manner. The United States has long prided itself on being a beacon for the world, and we're right now in very perilous times. And for journalists, that makes her job even tougher and more dangerous.
Well, David, I really appreciate you telling us what's going on in the world of journalism and what the challenges are around the world. It's as we discussed previously, it's really an underreported issue, and there's as you kind of alluded to, there's U.S. roots to some of the problems. I think it was last year, A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, wrote an extensive opinion piece talking about some of these problems around the world and tracing back the use of the word fake news and enemies of the people, kind of a despicable description of the press taking historical words to apply in that manner, and those have the genesis in Washington D.C. We're not a political broadcast here, but we have to identify the source of some of these issues, and clearly President Trump has lionized the press here in the United States, and that has given comfort to autocrats around the world, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, and others, to use that phrase fake news to call out journalists and enemies of the people. And Sulzberger in his op-ed, and I would encourage people to take a look at that. It was from September of last year, I believe. Really laid out the case for people getting more concerned about the abuse rhetorically and physically around the world of journalists, and underscoring the important role they play in preserving and protecting our democracy and shining a light on corruption and malfeasance in government and elsewhere.
David, you mentioned Maria Ressa, right, in the Philippines. One of my favorite programs, and I recommend it for anybody who's interested in international relations because it tends to have an international bent, but it's Christiane Amanpour. And she basically has taken over the slot that a guy named Charlie Rose used to have. And she will interview 2 or 3 or maybe 4 sometimes people. Most of the topics are international, but many of them are domestic. And one of the really wonderful interviews she had was with Maria Ressa, who's just an ebullient, nice person. And you could see what's going on in the Philippines and how Duterte has manipulated the law to try to shut down freedom of the press. So I recommend that program to you. And I know if you go and Google Christiane Amanpour, she has archived those old conversations, so you can go and watch those things on your own leisure.
Yeah, no, she's an excellent journalist. Another closer to home, one of the things that I heard Jorge Ramos of Univision speak recently at the Society of Professional Journalists Conference. This was in early September of this year, where he talked about an interview with the president of Venezuela, and how he had accused him of Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, had accused him of being a dictator, and immediately Ramos and his crew were detained for several hours. And he has asked some political leaders some tough questions over the years, but even Fidel Castro many years ago. But that kind of treatment was unusual, to say, because you asked a question I didn't like, I'm going to throw you potentially in jail. And this is a real threat. And it took international pressure, company pressure, to say you shouldn't be doing that. To Pat's point about fake news, that's extremely damaging. And part of I guess one of the reasons we did Civility Tennessee, aside from civil discourse, is really to let people get to know journalists and our journalism. We see research from the Pew Center and also the American Press Institute, that says that only about 20% of Americans have ever met a journalist. And I don't know what the figures are globally, but it shows that people get their impression of journalists based on what politicians and what the media they consume say. And oftentimes it's not accurate. In most cases, like myself, we live in neighborhoods, we shop at the same places our readers and consumers do. And we certainly want to see our community succeed and thrive. But that's certainly not the impression that many people have because of those stereotypes and those images. One of the things to note, Pat, you had mentioned President Trump. He has used that caustic rhetoric. And if you look at the Republican National Convention, their platform, it basically recycles the 2016 platform and adds a page that is very critical to members of the press. I often prefer to use the word press over media because it speaks to what our freedom is. Of the 5 freedoms we have in the First Amendment, freedom of the press is one fundamental one. Right. An interesting point here is that unlike other countries, when I worked in Mexico, or interned there, we had to register with the state, and there was an Article 33 of the Constitution that could be used as an excuse to kick out foreigners if we were causing too much trouble. Here in the United States, there's so much freedom. I don't need a license to be a journalist. And that means that we have to police ourselves, regulate ourselves to gain trust. But that means it's very difficult because we don't have a council of people saying, if you screwed up, we're just gonna, we're gonna kick you out of the profession.
Well, there was the case this year after COVID of New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other journalists in Beijing being shown the door because they were reporting about what journalists report about in a country like China during an episode like the pandemic. And the Trump administration retaliated by, I think they classified certain organs of reporters who were in the States as agents of a foreign government. So, there's reciprocity that we need to be careful about when dealing with journalists, because whatever we do in the United States, this or that autocrat around the world can use that as the example of how to treat journalists.
Yes, exactly.
Hey, David, I had a question, if you don't mind, and please correct what I'm getting ready to say if you have different information on it. But the surveys I've seen, in recent times suggest that, in the United States at least, that public trust of the press is a little bit in decline. Now, it hasn't sunk to the level of Congress or President Trump or anything like that, but that it has been in decline. And if you think that's accurate, because maybe there's some other polls that say something different, and certainly some of that is because of the horrific attacks that the Trump administration has been making on the press. But are there other reasons behind that? Why, if that's true, because that, freedom of the press, I couldn't agree more, is really important, but it's also important that the public trusts the press to present information that helps us make decisions and know what's going on and so forth and so on. So if you could comment on that, I'd be interested.
Sure. Rick, you're absolutely correct. Since the 1960s, there's been a decline in trust of institutions across America, including the press. Which I think that one of the last surveys I saw was in the 20 percentile, whereas Congress has generally been between 9 and 18%. And a lot of it is anti-institutional bias. Back in the 1970s with the Watergate crisis, the scandal, the press, a lot of people went into journalism. You know, the press had a great reputation because they were going against the government, but you've seen a lot of efforts to delegitimize the press. And this is one of the things that's really hard. I think in this era, what I'm most concerned about these days is misinformation and disinformation campaigns, whether it's from Russia inserting itself in the US election through bots and fake Twitter accounts and Facebook posts, or other bad actors trying to confuse people. This is one of the biggest challenges right now I have, is even convincing many of our own residents in Tennessee that COVID-19 is serious, that it is infectious, that it is deadly. You know, people, it's easy when people are hurting, especially economically, to start to believe anyone who will tell them that they have the relief, that they have the panacea for them, when in fact we know what the data show us. And this is one of the things that concerns me. It's not just attacks against the press, it's attacks against academics, against diplomats, attacks against librarians even, you know, people who are supposed to be our front line of sending our message of freedom, sending our message of trust. I just recently gave a TED talk at Belmont University, and it was all about creating spaces for public disagreement in this very polarized time. And a question that I had up in the billboard, and I won't belabor the story, but it just said, why should we trust you? It was a question that I was asked by someone in rural Tennessee, and it was a great question because he let me answer it. And when I told him about what we were doing to try to regain his trust, because his angst was based upon the fact that in 2016, all the messages he heard from the media sources that he consumed were that Donald Trump was going to lose the election, Hillary Clinton was going to win. So he saw the polls as being wrong, he saw the media as delegitimized in his mind. And when he met me and talked to me, suddenly there was a connection there. The problem is this is hard to scale. You need a lot of people doing this work. And so many journalists are busy covering the news that it's hard to make those community connections. And you know, one of the challenges, especially in this pandemic, is that as much as I love seeing you all in Zoom, I prefer to be in the same room as you, which would make a much more enjoyable experience. But this is what we have. We have to do with what we can. I have to give a shout out to Pat. He was my first guest on my Tennessee Voices podcast, and we're about to air episode 100 this week. So it's an opportunity to get people to see people in the face. You know, we need this contact so that we can build those relationships. One of the last things I'll do before moving on is that I say a phrase, and this is not original to me, but I've modified it. And it's that facts don't change people's minds, but relationships can. And I found through Civility Tennessee that when building that trust, you can certainly guide people to where they need to be. And I can be guided to places where I didn't think, where I thought I was right, and maybe I wasn't. And so I think that part of the exchange is really important.
Thanks for that.
Well, thanks, David, for that conversation. And you're 100% right that we need more face-to-face contact, and Zoom.
But we also need, I think, Pat, to educate, especially our young people, on how to discern what's fake and what's real. The whole idea that there are no such things as facts anymore is absurd. I mean, the sun will come up in the east tomorrow morning. You can bet on it. It's a fact. It's not going to change. And yet there are people out there that are yelling and screaming and are getting attention. And that gets into the social media aspect of anybody being able to throw stuff out there. And you know, things go viral that are totally made up and totally not true. The blurring between reporting and editorializing has totally been destroyed in my lifetime. I mean, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when the editorial page was one thing and the news page was something else, and now it's just all in one big blur. So well, that's my rant for the day.
When you add in the problem of foreign interference and deliberate disinformation, it's difficult to sort all that out. But we're going to move on here. I'll just add the comment that based on our last survey, the humble trio here at the Global News Review has been rated 100% credible all the time, every day, every night. So I won't tell you.
Coattails then.
I won't tell you what the sample size was of that survey, but we're in good shape. Moving on, we're going to talk about several issues kind of balled together in one piece, and that's the question of nuclear weapons and the presidency. And we're going to start this off with a conversation about this weekend's parade in North Korea, in Pyongyang. You probably have seen the pictures from that, where North Korea rolled out a tremendous ICBM on a mobile launcher. And it really raised a lot of eyebrows because this is a much larger weapon than, let's see if we can get the picture of this thing up here, because this was really an eye-opening, come on CNN, cooperate, an eye-opening display of what the North Koreans have been up to. I think you can see that now. But it was a missile that had not been seen before in public. It goes to the question of what North Korea has been up to in the time that has passed since President Trump met with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. And just as a military analyst, I'll caveat the watching of this parade with the notion that societies like these have been known in the past to parade mock-ups of things that were not actual military hardware. So keep that in mind. I don't know if it's paper mache or duct tape and chicken baling wire or whatever, but it certainly brought some attention to the question of what's going on in North Korea. So we have in the background an increasingly dangerous international landscape in terms of nuclear weapons. We've seen the joint comprehensive plan of action with Iran and the P5+1 powers, the so-called Iran nuclear deal, be set aside by the Trump administration. We've also eliminated the INF treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty with Russia, which had been negotiated with the Soviet Union. We've given up on the Open Skies Agreement, which was an agreement with Russia and NATO that each side could fly aircraft over the other to do inspection. And this is basically a confidence building measure. Some people argue that satellites can do the same thing, but allowing the other side to fly aircraft over one sovereign territory was one measure of cooperation in dealing with nuclear arms on either side. So, we're looking at competition between the United States and Russia. China's expected to double their nuclear inventory in the next 10 years. We have conflicts between nuclear powers like China and India over the border, and Breck gave a great laydown of what that was all about a couple of weeks ago. India, Pakistan, both are nuclear armed. They're at odds over Kashmir, and India seizing complete authority in Kashmir in this past year has put that issue more in the forefront. So these are all things they're going on in the background. They don't get a lot of conversation, and I don't know why in the presidential debates or in the conversations about choosing a president, there's not more conversation about not just foreign relations, but specifically about our nuclear posture and what the issues and the dangers are. Because you can look at any authority on nuclear and national security issues, and they'll tell you that we're in a more dangerous position regarding this existential threat, the nuclear weapons around the world, than we've been in quite some time. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the people who keep the so-called doomsday clock, you may have heard of that. It sets the clock at a number of minutes before midnight and keeps track of existential threats like nuclear weapons, pandemics, climate change, and so forth. In January of 2019, they reset the clock to 90 seconds before midnight, the closest it's been to the rhetorical position where the world is at great threat from these sorts of issues. And in January of this year, they reaffirmed that we are in that precarious position. I would recommend that our viewers take a look in our youtube.com/TNWAC archive for a program we did a month and a half ago with Secretary William Perry and Tom Kalina from Plowshares. And Plowshares is the #1 institution advocating for reductions and elimination of nuclear weapons. Secretary Perry and Tom Kalina wrote a book called The Button, and in it they talked about the proliferation of nuclear weapons and removing the number of weapons in arsenals. One of the issues that they talked about was the New START treaty, and we've discussed that here before. But basically, the United States and Russia in 2010 signed an agreement called New START, and that limited, put a ceiling on the number of weapons, nuclear weapons, strategic weapons that each side could possess. So it set a cap on launchers, actual warheads, and so forth. That agreement, excuse me, that agreement expires, and if we don't act before February, it will go away and it will remove the constraints on nuclear weapons and launch systems and so forth between the two countries. By mere agreement between the presidents, and President Putin has indicated he's willing to renew the New START. If the United States side agrees, a 5-year continuation will happen without any additional treaty obligations. And it is a treaty, so it has to be ratified by the Senate. But if both sides agree, it just goes on as before. So those who are concerned about nuclear weapons, the proliferation and the size of arsenals between Russia and the United States are pushing for that to be approved. In the meantime, the Trump administration is trying to open the can on New START and renegotiate. They want to bring China into the conversation. The Chinese are not interested in getting involved in arms control because their inventory is much less than Russia and the United States. But the United States wants to bring them in the umbrella of New START. So that's complicating the issue. Also complicating the issue is the development on both sides of new types of weapons. And these are things like ground-based, boost-launched, nuclear-armed missiles that can go 6,000 kilometers. The US has experimented with the hypersonic technology. The Russians have had some demonstrations that they've got these weapon systems ready to go. There was a nuclear-powered cruise missile that they've developed. They had an accident about 6 months ago in the north of Russia, and you may have heard about an explosion in a city in the north, unexplained, and the Russians haven't really discussed that, but it was traced to this development of a nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed cruise missile. Russia also has a multi-megaton, they call it a torpedo, but it's really an autonomous submersible launched from a submarine that could attack cities along a coastline. So these are strategic weapons that need to be brought under the umbrella of a strategic arrangement with the United States and Russia. So again, I'm mystified why these conversations are not part of our presidential vetting the positions of this side or the other side as to what their intentions are in the strategic nuclear weapons realm. These are important issues. Everybody thinks, well, we've never had a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States, so why should we worry about it now? Well, we never had a pandemic that shut down the world for 9 months and killed 1 million people around the world, quite like we're experiencing now. So these are black swans, things that you don't expect to happen, low probability, high impact events. And if we can build confidence between Russia and the United States over these nuclear weapons and limit the numbers that there are, less chance of an accident and less chance that they'll get out of control. Meanwhile, we need to be mindful of nuclear proliferation in the non-great power states around the world because those pose equal risks as well. One of the things that Secretary Perry and Tom Kalina talked about in their conversation that I had with them here was the issue of Seoul Nuclear Release Authority. And since Harry Truman, after the bombings of Japan with nuclear weapons, the authority to release nuclear weapons has rested with the commander-in-chief, the president. And that's one-man control of the entire nuclear arsenal. And that person without regard to this president or any other president, this party or any other party. Whoever is in the White House can at any time call upon the launch of a nuclear weapon or massive numbers of nuclear weapons with no constraint on the authority to do so. I can speak from experience, having served in the military in probably a half a dozen assignments in which I was involved in either the security of nuclear weapons or the command and control of launch of nuclear weapons in submarines, aircraft carriers, and cruisers that were nuclear armed. I understand completely how the system works below the presidential level, in that there are multiple levels of authority required, two-man control in the missile launch sites, multiple levels of control in submarines, and similarly in bombers before a nuclear weapon can be released. So the idea that any one person in the White House can exercise that authority is worrisome, if not frightening to many people. The title of this segment was Dexamethasone.
I was wondering when you were going to get to pronounce that word.
That Ambassador Bowers successfully navigated. Did you open that in your Google pronunciation guide?
Yeah, you know, there's this topic that you've got. I mean, to me, there's 3 or 4 different subtopics here. One is arms control, nuclear proliferation. The other is that single launch authority that we grant to the President of the United States, that basically that says that, you know, on his or her order, launch, you know, and a third is the 25th Amendment. At what point does the president become incapacitated to a sufficient degree that he should no longer have that launch authority and people should take it away from him? So
I'll mention that Secretary Perry made a couple of valid points,
yes,
more than a couple, but he talked about some of the experiences. For example, Richard Nixon, when he was in the last days in the White House, he was drinking heavily. Secretary of Defense Schlesinger gave instructions that if
to the military aid, right, in the White House. Yeah,
to the military aid in the White House, that if the president started talking about opening the football, the briefcase with the nuclear codes, that he was to be called immediately. And you know, there's some historical question about how he worded the order, but basically stepped in and put himself between the commander-in-chief and the nuclear launch authority, which technically is against the rules, probably a violation of law, but he did it for the sake of the country. So as you mentioned, you know, in the reference to dexamethasone, and you can Google side effects.
Well, basically, it impairs the individual's capacity to think rationally, right? And so, you know, you don't know. Here's a guy that has the capability of destroying the world, and he's on stuff. I don't know that that's a good thing.
And just the context of this is a reference to the president being treated for his COVID infection while he was at Walter Reed. One of the concoctions they gave him was dexamethasone, a steroid. And, you know, there's been talk in the press about what it does, but the Mayo Clinic says common side effects, aggression, agitation, anxiety, irritability, mental depression, mood changes, and nervousness. Now, if you were a launch control officer in a Minuteman silo in the upper Midwest, and you were taking dexamethasone, you would be relieved of your duties until you were deemed to be medically fit. However, our Constitution doesn't provide for that sort of accountability. And in the military, it's called the Personnel Reliability Program, where you're screened for suitability for nuclear weapons duties, but it doesn't apply to the commander-in-chief. But what does apply is the 25th Amendment, and a number of presidents, I think most recently George Bush exercised the 25th Amendment, where he signed over powers and duties of the office to the vice president while he was undergoing surgery. So he knew that he would not be able to discharge his duties properly during surgery.
Can I jump in on this, Pat, and sort of dig in a little bit? Because the 25th Amendment basically came about in 1965 and it was ratified in 67. So it was on a fast track to become a constitutional amendment. And there was a reason for that, because the succession powers were really not around. Like, what do you do if the president dies? It's one thing, the vice president takes over. But there are other conceivable operations. And this 25th Amendment has 4 different sections. And the first one says if the president is gone, the vice president takes over.
Right.
The second one says if the vice president is gone, the Senate the president appoints a new vice president, and the House and the Senate then confirm that person. The third, it says if the president can't serve, he can, or she could, write a letter to the Congress and say, I'm going to be out of operation here. So in the case of the United States, Section 1 has been used once. That's when Nixon resigned the office, right, and said, I'm out of here. The vice president took over. Section 2, Agnew resigned in 73, and Ford was appointed the vice president. And then when Ford took over from Nixon, he appointed Rockefeller as vice president. Section 3 has really only been used by George Bush when he notified the Congress that he was going to have a colonoscopy, and Mr. Cheney took over. Reagan also talked about using this Section 3, but basically just said, well, I'm going to be out for a while, but I'll be back. So he never really truly invoked it according to how you have to do that. So there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that we need to kind of look at, and people are looking at it now. And I think the Congress and the Democrats in the House have begun to sort of dig in a little bit. At what point is the president incapacitated, and who says, and how does this all work? So back to you.
Well, that's where we are. We wanted to give just a quick kludge of current events. North Korea rolling out a monster ICBM, the conversation about the New START. And I'll commend to your reading a report at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's called Restart for U.S.-Russian Nuclear Arms Control, Enhancing Security Through Cooperation. And it's by James Acton, A-C-T-O-N, and Pranay Vadi. They did a webinar this morning that I got to see most of, and they had an excellent conversation with a member of a Russian think tank, and Rose Gottmuller, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State negotiating the START agreement. She's an arms control specialist. So if you can catch that Carnegie, I'm sure they'll have it on their website, the video, but also the report by Acton and Vadi on the restart. That'll give you a great insight into what's going on with.
Can I return the favor to Dr. Walker there and ask him a question?
Sure. Let me just add that I noticed that in our chat box we've had a very lively conversation between David, some of our audience members, and I think all the questions have been answered there. So I won't recapitulate those. But if anybody has more questions, throw them in the chat box in the next 30 seconds, and we're trying to get to them. And now I pass the floor to Breck Walker.
So question 1 is, how many nuclear powers are there capable of or having nuclear weapons? And of those that have them, which of them have sole launch authority vested in one individual?
Well, the first one I could guess at, I'd probably have to sit there and think about it. And the second one I flat don't know.
I don't know the answer to this, but my impression is that the others have some kind of a redundant system that it takes more than one person to launch a weapon.
That's a really good question. I'm going to look into that, and I'll have an answer by next week.
Thank you.
Well, the nuclear powers, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations,
Right.
the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom. And then you've got the additional ones that came on. India in the 60s exploded a weapon, Pakistan in the 90s. Israel has what they call ambiguous commentary. They won't say yes, they won't say no. Israel's on there. So
The answer is yes.
Yes.
And China.
And North Korea.
Yeah.
South Africa had a program, they gave it up. Libya had a program, they gave it up. Iraq had a program, they gave it up. Iran. So there are probably 8 or 9 acknowledged nuclear states, and then there are those that are in an ambiguous status, either working towards or having the capability. You know, people talk about Japan having the capability to develop a weapon quickly if they wanted to, the technology and the ability to produce fissile material. They, at this point, don't want to. But 4 years ago in the campaign, the president said there'd be nothing wrong with Japan and South Korea getting nuclear weapons, and then the United States would not be bothered with what's going on in the Korean Peninsula. That policy has seemed to have shifted a little bit when he came out with the fire and fury speech. But you can't discount, as America returns to America first and our influence and presence in a lot of places in the realm of national security continues in the way that it has. A lot of these states are considering nuclear weapons as the answer to their security problems. Ambassador, anything more? I think we're.
I think that kind of wraps it up. I'm really glad that David was here. You come back.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
David, thanks again. We'll see you on debate night, the debate watch party on October 22nd. We have you moderating with a great group of, I won't call them speakers, but panelists, people who are going to talk about the mechanics of elections and polling. And we're going to do a little debate bingo. So if you have Bigly on your bingo card, you might be in good shape. So we're looking forward to that, and thanks for all your work on Civility Tennessee, and what you do to keep the people of Nashville and the wider regions of Tennessee informed. You and your colleagues here in Nashville, and your colleagues around the world, who some of them are battling troubles they don't need to be dealing with. So we're glad we got to talk about that a little bit.
Thank you,
gentlemen. Thanks so much for being here. Ambassador Byers, Dr. Walker, we'll see you
Commander
next week.
Ryan.
Good to see you guys.
Good
Enjoyed
to see
it.
you. Take care.
Fair winds.